Well, welcome, folks. I am going to introduce our session tonight. We have both Boyd Collins and Doug Smith for tonight. On behalf of the Planning Committee, consisting of Evan Folds, Frank Dowenauer, Doug Smith, and myself, Andrew Linnell, I want to extend over the internet a warm welcome to each of you, the participants, and to our distinguished set of speakers and workshop leaders. I do mean participants. I hope we can do more than confer with one another. The times in which we live need more than thought. The times call to our souls for feelings and our willings. It is a time to build bridges from natural science to spiritual science. And natural science is becoming ready with its new concepts, such as emergence. But these are challenging times, and building such a bridge will not be easy. Those who took part in the Spring 2020 Beginner Study Group from MysTech will know this quote well from Lecture 4, the cycle entitled Lucifer and Ahriman. No more evil advice could be given than to say, stay just as you are. For Ahriman will make all of you clairvoyant if you so desire. And you will desire it because Ahriman's power will be very great. But the result would be the establishment of Ahriman's kingdom on earth and the overthrow of everything achieved hitherto by human culture. All the disastrous tendencies unconsciously cherished by humankind today would take effect. Our concern is that the wisdom of the future, a clairvoyant wisdom, shall be rescued from the clutches of Ahriman. Again, let it be repeated that there is only one book of wisdom, not two kinds of wisdom. The issue is whether this wisdom is in the hands of Ahriman or of Christ. It cannot come into the hands of Christ unless people fight for it. And they can only fight for it by telling themselves that by their own efforts, they must assimilate the content of spiritual science before the time of Ahriman's appearance on earth. So one theme you will hear often has to do with the coming changes to our physical body. One view is that of transhumanism. Another view is that brought forth by Rudolf Steiner. These changes call forth deep moral questions. To that tune, our speakers tonight will share from their experiences in the field of technology and in the field of biotech. Steiner talked about an ability to set motors in motion according to the laws of reciprocal oscillations, and that this has been already given to humanity. It is no longer a question of the what, but by whom. The issue is how. How will it come? From those with egotistical ambitions or from those with selfless motivations? So let me introduce now to you Boyd Collins. Boyd was a software architect for 20 years for large multinational corporations, including Novartis, SAIC, British Petroleum, Shell Oil, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, Astra Merck Pharmaceuticals. He has been designing user experiences for web applications since 1994. In the 1980s, he joined the Cistercian Abbey of Genesee in New York State, where he explored spiritual practices with monks of the same order as the late Thomas Merton. During the Iraq War, he was an active anti-war blogger whose blog, The Nonviolent Jesus, was widely followed by anti-war activists. In 2011, he explored spiritual approaches to peacemaking, and it was then that he discovered the works of Rudolf Steiner. He has been a member of the Anthroposophical Society for about 6 years. His primary focus of study is on artificial intelligence and the effects of social media on spiritual growth and the spiritual beings behind current social and historical trends. His articles have appeared in the MysTech Journal and in Being Human and other publications. He is retired and living in the Philippines with his wife. I was pleasantly surprised when Boyd enrolled in the MysTech Beginners Group. In the last semester, Boyd would write a synopsis that he presented at the start of each of the weekly study groups. This helped us to focus our work and to get to know Boyd even better. When we met in the evening, he was sipping coffee in the early mornings of life in the Philippines. And we learned then that power outages and internet interruptions were fairly common. So as we welcome Boyd Collins, I have to admit his talk, we have recorded it, but Boyd is here live to answer your questions at the end of the session. So allow me now to move over to his pre-recorded session. And this will take me just a moment. I'm sorry, but that's how it is. Oh boy. And of course, we're not hearing it.
Hello, and the title of my talk is Engineered Addiction, AI-enabled attention management and machine gambling in social media. Portrait of a Digital Addict. I want to start out by giving you an idea about what's behind this presentation. I sometimes do youth counseling and was once brought in to help with a young man in his mid-20s who seemed like an intelligent, sensitive sort of guy. He had studied one of the most difficult programming languages, C++, in college, and made A's in his courses. But after a year or so, he dropped out and started sitting alone in his room, mesmerized all day long by YouTube videos, video games, and Facebook. He had no job, no school, and no prospects. I spoke with his parents. They had struggled to find the right therapist, the right job, the right school, maybe just get him out of the house and around the block once a week, but without success. One day during my weekly meeting with him, he told me that there was a monkey in his head that was driving him wherever the monkey wanted to go. That monkey was YouTube, Facebook, games, and the dozens of other traps set to snare our attention. And he wanted my help to take back the wheel from the monkey. After much research, I began to work with him using some of the techniques that I'll describe at the end of this talk. After we had used them for a few weeks, he gradually began to open himself to other people. Perhaps you know or have heard of young people in a similar predicament. To make a long story short, I began to learn everything I could about digital addiction, how it works, who designs it, and most important of all, who profits from it.
Yes, right.
This talk is the result of what I learned.
Yes, right.
Effective collusion. According to French sociologist Bruno Latour, machine interaction has become a means probably no economic sector has been more successful at squeezing out the maximum earnings per customer than the gambling industry. Video slot machines are designed to extract as much revenue per player as possible in the shortest amount of time. The major gaming companies have made huge investments over the past 40 years to ensure that gamblers play longer, faster,
I am going to ask Boyd, can you come off of mute? Because we're having some technical difficulty making that work. And what I would like to do is I can show the slides, Boyd, but do you want to speak to them? Or would you like to try screen sharing from your place? Okay, well, then I will try this again. I'm sorry, everyone, but we are.
Yeah, I can do that, Frank. It just, Andrew, it'll just take me a second. Let me open it up here.
As you're coming through just fine right now.
Okay, all right, well, that's good. Let me go ahead and open up the presentation. Okay. And I'll go with it. If you could show the slides, that would be great. Because the slides and the presentation are separate. So is there any way you could just show the slides?
I can, but I would have to figure out how to turn off the audio because the audio and the visual are integrated in the deck that the link that I have.
Okay, you just have to, you could just delete it. You could just open it up and then delete the audio. Yeah, I'll tell you what, I can just go ahead and just, give the presentation directly.
I think that's best if you could.
Yeah,
Or you can just mute your mic and just show the slides.
Okay. Let me just, the thing is I don't have it on this computer right now.
Oh, okay, then I will show the slides. I will try what Frank just said.
Okay.
And we'll see if we can. Sorry, folks, for this.
Yeah, I've got everything ready once you show the slides.
Okay, the first slide is up. Let me just get the screen share going.
The title of my
Yeah. Okay, so you ready for me to go?
Yes, go ahead, Boyd.
Okay, I want to start out by telling a personal story about why I've done this and what my work is about. I sometimes do youth counseling, and I was once brought in to help with a young man in his mid-20s who seemed like an intelligent, sensitive sort of guy. He had studied one of the most difficult programming languages, C++, and had made A's in his college courses. But after a year or so, he dropped out and he started sitting alone in his room, mesmerized all day long by YouTube videos, video games, and Facebook. He had no job, no school, no prospects. I spoke with his parents. They had struggled to find the right therapist, the right job, the right school, or maybe just get him out of the house and around the block once a week, but without success. One day during my weekly meeting with him, he told me that there was a monkey in his head that was driving him wherever the monkey wanted to go. That monkey was YouTube, Facebook, games, and the dozens of other traps set to snare our attention. He wanted my help to take the wheel back from that monkey. After much research, I began to work with him using some of the techniques that I'll describe at the end of this talk. After we had used them for a few weeks, he gradually began to open himself to other people. Perhaps you know or have heard of young people in a similar predicament. To make a long story short, I began to learn everything I could about digital addiction, how it works, who designs it, and most important of all, who profits from it. This talk is the result of what I learned. Okay, now we'll switch over to the effective collusion slide now. And according to French sociologist Bruno Latour, machine interaction has become a means through which individuals can manage their affective states and create a personal buffer zone against the uncertainties and worries of the world. Just as gamblers climb into the video screen and get lost, many social media users get lost trying to meet their need for nurturing relationships while avoiding the risk and rewards that come from face-to-face interactions. For both gamblers and social media users, researchers have found the science of behavioral modification is being applied at scale to ensure a steady flow of profit for the parent companies. Probably no economic sector has been more successful at squeezing out the maximum earnings per customer than the gambling industry. Video slot machines are designed to extract as much revenue per player as possible in the shortest amount of time. The major gaming companies have made huge investments over the past 40 years to ensure that gamblers play longer, faster, and more intensely. Their results have been extremely successful. In many ways, the techniques developed for the machine gambling act as the reference architecture for maintaining user captivation across a variety of online platforms. This industry, due to its focus on a single experience, has had decades in which to refine the screen display and algorithms used to maximize player engagement. By studying the behavioral techniques used in the gaming industry, we can understand the purpose behind similar methods used by companies such as Facebook to ensure user immersion. Since the 1990s, video slot machines have been the most lucrative gaming platform. According to gambling addiction researcher Nancy Petrie, no other form of gambling manipulates the human mind as beautifully as these machines. Every detail is precisely designed to induce a suggestible state in its customers so that once in their sheltered cocoons, they can exit from human space and give themselves up completely to the screen. As one gambler said about his video slot machine experience, the zone is like a magnet. It just pulls you in and holds you there. Once they are in the zone, nothing else exists for gamers. The human beings around them become invisible. What is critical to understand about the basic mechanism used to ensure continuous gaming productivity is that it works through a kind of complicity between gambler and machine. The behavioral mechanisms we are examining here are not brainwashing methods that turn the player into a robot. Instead, the software in the machine seeks to generate an experience that the gambler learns to value for its own sake. Once hooked, he or she no longer gambles in hope of a jackpot, but comes to value the, quote, zone described above, in which he or she becomes so immersed in the game that the outer world, with all its challenges and responsibility, ceases to exist. A powerful link is forged through a kind of collusion between the structures and functions of the machine and the cognitive, affective, and bodily capacities of the gambler. Gambling machine design is driven by a quest for a perfect fit between player and machine, so that gamblers can, quote, play to extinction, meaning that they habitually play until their funds are exhausted. All the elements that make up the gambling experience are organized around this central principle. Later, we will uncover related algorithmic learning techniques used in social media. Again, that's the key point here. Social media is based on many of the techniques used in machine gambling. Okay, if we could switch to the next slide now. Next slide here is the Skinner box. Okay, gamblers are often keenly aware of their entrapment. As one wrote, why do some of us get caught into a kind of paralysis that blots out time, responsibility, logic, even movement? A fellow addict responded that the machine were, quote, Skinner boxes, designed according to the principles of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning reinforces animal and human behavior through a carefully designed schedule of rewards and punishments. One of its key elements is the reward schedule, also known as the reinforcement schedule. In video slot machines, the reinforcement schedule used in order to time actual winnings is known as the random ratio schedule, in which every round is independent of the previous round and therefore carries the same probability of a reward. It is based on B.F. Skinner's early experiments in which he varied the schedule of behavioral reinforcements in order to determine which resulted in the highest and most reliable rate of response. He found that a schedule in which the reward is provided after an unpredictable number of user responses ensured the greatest frequency and the steadiest rate of response. As one gaming machine designer encapsulated his experience, frequent small payoffs appear to reinforce customers more than large infrequent payoffs. This is exactly the type of schedule used to reinforce the compulsive use of social media through likes and other rewards. So again, social media is patterned after the B.F. Skinner reinforcement schedule. As one canny gambler summed it up, simply put, it means that the rewards, pellets, are dispensed on a random schedule. Sometimes the rat gets none, sometimes a few, sometimes a lot of pellets. Sounding familiar yet? He never knows when he's going to get a pellet, so he keeps pushing that lever over and over and over, even if none come out. The rat becomes obsessed, addicted, if you will. This then is the psychological principle that slot machines operate on and how it operates on you. A quite similar reinforcement schedule is used in social media algorithms with some interesting AI variations that we will study later. Okay, if we could switch to the next slide. This slide is in tune with the machine. Okay. While the jackpot is the lure that initially entices the gambler, the most disturbing research finding is that as their addiction deepens, gamblers stop seeking the payout. What they actually crave is something called the, quote, machine zone, a state of self-forgetting in which one is carried along by an irresistible momentum that feels like one is being played by the machine. The machine zone is associated with a loss of self-awareness, automatic behavior, and a total rhythmic absorption carried along a wave of compulsion. It is the product of a collusive merger between the gambler and the machine. Natasha Dow-Schul, the author of a classic study of machine gambling titled Addiction by Design, asked a key question. What are the technological conditions by which interaction turns into immersion, autonomy into automaticity, control into compulsion? While entertainment or wins are usually offered as the excuse for gambling, what players actually want is to lose themselves and get absorbed in the rhythm of play. It is an experience characterized not by stimulation, participation, and gratification of agency, but by uninterrupted flow, immersion, and self-erasure. When they enter the ideal flow state, they can no longer distinguish between their own actions and those of the machine. One player summarized her feelings in this way: sometimes I feel this vibration between what I want and what happens. In surrendering to the flow, the player willingly merges with the machine. There is an art to getting players into the zone that requires many elements of the player's experience to be expertly balanced. The combination of inner states machine programmers aim at are summarized by one gambler in this way. The zone state is obtainable only at the threshold where rhythm holds sway over risk, comfort over perturbation, habituation over surprise. Both elements of each pair are required. The player must be able to fall into a rhythm, but it is only compelling when combined with a sense of risk. The impression of a smooth ride, a well-managed series of wins and losses that evokes the illusion of winning is hard to believe in unless they are exposed to danger along the way. In addition, surprises must be delivered at a steady rate in order to solidify the habits of play, which are being conditioned. These are the elements that make for compulsive engagement. In the next section, we will switch to social media and see how the addictive practices illustrated above work on these platforms. Okay, if we could switch to the iGen meltdown slide. Around 2012, college counselors in the US suddenly encountered an enormous spike in the number of students seeking counseling. Seemingly overnight, the number of students seeking mental health counseling massively expanded, and the standard mix of teenage issues was dominated by something that used to be relatively rare: anxiety. The administrator of one health center had a hunch that smartphone usage might be a factor. A few years later, this administrator's hunch was validated by San Diego State University psychology professor Jean Twenge, one of the foremost experts on generational differences in American youth. Twenge's article was titled, "Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation?" She characterized the sudden change as follows. The gentle slopes of the line grass became steep mountains and sheer cliffs. This change occurred near the exact point at which American ownership of smartphones passed the 50% mark. Twenge also found that social media was the prime factor in the sudden anxiety outbreak among members of the iGen, those born between 1995 and 2012. She found that rates of teen depression and suicide have skyrocketed since 2011. It is not an exaggeration to describe iGen as being on the brink of the worst mental health crisis in decades. Much of this deterioration can be traced to their phones. Her findings about teen mental health were stark and clear. Teens who spend more time than average on screen activities are more likely to be unhappy. And those who spend more time than average on non-screen activities are more likely to be happy. Twenge found a direct correlation between unhappiness among teens and social media use, particularly Facebook. Since 2017, hundreds of additional peer-reviewed studies have been released which lend support to her conclusions. And I've listed many of these studies in the bibliography for this paper. Okay, let's switch to the attention market, because what we need to do is understand the economic background here. In order to understand how social media algorithms work, we begin by explaining the economic force that drives the major platforms. Only in this way can we reveal why the motivation to predict and even control user behavior is such a critical priority for the major platforms. The new economic model, often referred to as, quote, surveillance capitalism, was first developed by Google in the early 2000s. Google discovered a new formula for generating revenue based on its huge cache of behavioral data. Google used its computational power and expertise toward the single task of matching ads with queries. By doing so, Google was able to maximize the revenue it gets by giving its best position to the advertiser who is likely to pay Google the most in total based on the price per click multiplied by Google's estimate of the likelihood that someone will actually click on the ad. In other words, the higher the likelihood of an ad click, the greater the revenue for Google. Ads could now be precisely targeted at individuals due to what the company knew about their search behavior. From this point on, the combination of ever-increasing machine intelligence and rapidly expanding supplies of behavioral data, also known as behavioral surplus, became the foundation for an unprecedented logic of accumulation. Advertisers could now appeal to the user at the exact point in time at which he or she was most vulnerable to persuasion. By 2019, Google's annual revenue had risen to $160.7 billion per year, mostly based on ad revenue. The age of surveillance capitalism had begun. In her landmark study, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff documents how the revenues of companies such as Google and Facebook are based directly on the accuracy of their behavioral predictions as derived from user data. Here she describes what happens to our data once it is collected. Although some of these data are applied to product or service improvement, the rest are declared as a proprietary behavioral surplus fed into advanced manufacturing processes known as machine intelligence and fabricated into prediction products that anticipate what you will do now, soon, and later. Finally, these prediction products are traded in a new kind of marketplace for behavioral predictions that I call behavioral futures markets. Essentially, data concerning our habits, preferences, and decision is harvested through various online platforms such as Google, Facebook, Alexa, and increasingly the Internet of Things. This data is used to assemble profile packages that provide intimate insight into how to nudge, tune, herd, manipulate, and modify user behavior. These packages are sold to advertisers and other third parties. They are designed to reveal individual motivational factors which choice architects can use to promote behaviors advantageous to businesses and other interested parties. These packages are sold to advertisers that make the highest bids. The companies involved soon discovered that the new economic order could not reach its full potential until they moved beyond aggregating user data and began to shape it. To achieve such accuracy, Nicholas Carr, the acclaimed technology writer, once quipped, "The best way to predict behavior is to script it." Using behavioral modification techniques, social media can be programmed to discover and even initiate product trends. Carr describes the fundamental breakthrough. It was Facebook, with its incredibly detailed data on people's social lives, that grasped digital media's full potential for behavior modification by using what it called its social graph to map the intentions, desires, and interactions of literally billions of individuals. It saw that it could turn its network into a worldwide Skinner box, employing psychological triggers and rewards to program not only what people see, but how they react. Companies following this model can maximize profits by increasing the accuracy of their behavioral predictions. Behavioral surplus must be vast and varied, but the surest way to predict behavior is to intervene at its source and shape it. To achieve the desired revenue targets, operant conditioning must be used to enforce pre-selected behaviors. Unfortunately, according to Carr, what the industry of the futures will seek to manufacture is the self. Okay, now we switch to the next slide with the gentle art of user tuning. Okay. The more information that can be gathered about a user, the more precisely the user can be targeted, and the higher the value of the prediction packages sold to advertisers. Therefore, keeping the user engaged is a primary behavioral target. As one-time Facebook president Sean Parker admitted, Facebook was designed to consume the maximum possible amount of users' time and consciousness. The idea was to send you a little dopamine hit every once in a while, aka variable reinforcement, in the form of likes and comments. The goal was to keep users glued to the hive, chasing those hits while leaving a stream of raw materials in their wake. Shoshana Zuboff drew the parallel between machine gambling and social media in this way. Just as gamblers chase the zone of fusion with the machine, a young person embedded in the culture of mutuality chases the zone of fusion with the social mirror. Okay, and this is a theme I found over and over of people comparing this machine gambling with social media. Here we examine some of the techniques used to ensure such streams of profitable raw materials. User management strategies drive obsessive social media engagement to achieve profit targets similar to those attained in the world of machine gambling. To keep the roles clear, we need to understand a two-level user conditioning strategy. The first level involves a software agent, in other words, an algorithm that reads the user profile attributes and tries different strategies to keep the user engaged, as we will describe in detail below. This software agent, in turn, is trained using machine learning techniques so that it can train the platform user to produce the optimal behaviors. Okay, now let me try and simplify. Stuart Russell, a leading figure in artificial intelligence, described how social media algorithms ensure high click-through rates. The solution is simply to present items that the user likes to click on, right? Wrong. The solution is to change the user's preferences so that they become more predictable. A more predictable user can be fed items they are likely to click on, thereby generating more revenue. Okay, and this is again a key principle. The job of the software agent is therefore to maximize user predictability. Like any rational entity, the algorithm learns how to modify the state of its environment, in this case, the user's mind, in order to maximize its own reward. Keep these two solution elements clearly separated. The software agent that modifies the state of the user's mind and the user whose behavior is being tuned toward well-defined corporate objectives. These are the two major factors in training or tuning users to meet behavioral targets. Okay, now let's draw a picture here. Jaron Lanier encapsulated the algorithmic training process as follows. When an algorithm is feeding experiences to a person, it turns out that the randomness that lubricates algorithmic adaptation can also feed human addiction. The algorithm is trying to capture the perfect parameters for manipulating a brain, while the brain, in order to seek out deeper meaning, is changing in response to the algorithm's experiments. It's a cat and mouse game based on pure math. Because the stimuli from the algorithm don't mean anything, because they genuinely are random, the brain isn't adapting to anything real, but to a fiction. That process of becoming hooked on an elusive mirage is addiction. As the algorithm tries to escape a rut, the human mind becomes stuck in one. Okay, in other words, while you are scanning your Facebook newsfeed, adaptive algorithms are constantly monitoring your online actions, seeking specific cognitive biases that can be exploited, such as a preference for the color electric blue, or a word such as extreme. These are user triggers that used to induce desired actions. The test scenarios are based on previous social media and search activity. The test scenarios are guided by the individual profile values, such as risk taker, which have been assigned to the user based on previous social media and search activity. These algorithms are labeled adaptive because they generate different responses randomly, such as a new combination of screen colors or descriptive text. They then record the user reaction to the interface adjustment in order to adapt to this user's specific personality traits more and more accurately. This is a similar process to that used in machine gambling to make users believe that they are learning to beat the system. The user is made to believe that he or she is learning to game the algorithm so that it delivers the best possible experience, while what's actually happening is that the algorithm is mastering the user's behavior. Okay, so that's the key point. The algorithm is mastering the user's behavior by trying different things until it gets a good match. In technical terms, the machine learning models which generate the user training algorithm are constantly collecting feedback on the effectiveness of its conditioning. The results are then used to modify subsequent actions by the algorithmic agent. As indicated, it tries different methods in a purely random fashion in order to improve its success rate. But there is no necessary pattern to the trials. In one instance, it might try a message from a friend that mentions a preferred printer brand. Another time, it might display a picture of the printer with star ratings. It may also vary the timing of the ads to see if a 2-second delay works better than a 5-second one. Over time, users are conditioned to habitually respond to targeted stimuli. The cumulative effect is that the user enters the zone, a flow of compulsive interaction. In this game, the algorithm, not the user, becomes the autonomous agent. What is critical to understand is not simply that social media users are being conditioned to increase sales for advertisers or to trigger compulsive user engagement in order to generate rich supplies of behavioral surplus. These are simply contributory factors to the main goal, which is, as Douglas Rushkoff put it, to get users to behave more consistently with their profiles and the consumer segment to which they have been assigned. The better it does at making us conform to our algorithmically determined destiny, the more the platform can boast both its predictive accuracy and its ability to induce behavior change. In other words, the goal is to ensure that we conform as closely as possible to the behaviors assigned to our profile classification. They are not so much concerned with the specifics of how we support the profit margins of the tech giants as that we are programmable enough to support any objectives that may be found convenient to the lords of the clouds. And this can only be guaranteed by increasing human predictability. Okay, if we could move to the final slide. Final slide is titled The Path to Freedom. In my counseling work with the young man mentioned at the beginning, I emphasize these fundamental concepts. Number one, self-regulation, self-respect, and the ability to focus on the task at hand. And number two, imagining what an addiction-free future might look like. My advice is not a blanket rejection of the technology that seeks to control us, but a simple recognition. By coming to recognize the embedded biases or affordances of today's digital media technologies, we enable ourselves to leverage their benefits and compensate for their deficits, rather than unconsciously conforming to their influences. By understanding the goals and methods of the algorithmic control system described, we can identify points of awareness which can be used to leverage the technologies in ways that enhance rather than degrade our autonomy. It is a continuous struggle towards consciousness that makes our intentions the controlling factor. By focusing our consciousness on our goals, our autonomy begins to grow and thrive. I conclude with an essential practice that has been the door to freedom for many caught in the web of digital addiction. It is found in a recent book by Cal Newport titled Digital Minimalism: Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World. Connection versus conversation. The key issue is that using social media tends to take people away from real-world socializing that is massively more valuable. The addictive nature of social media is directly related to our primal need to connect with others. Social media can only offer a simulation of face-to-face conversation, but since it is much less troublesome to arrange than physical interaction, it quickly becomes the default means for pursuing relationships. Unfortunately, the nature of the medium prevents such relationships from being truly nurturing. So it launches a vicious cycle. Users try to satisfy their social needs in a way that promises fulfillment, but is unable to deliver. They respond by doubling down on social media in a desperate attempt to eke out social rewards. However, the time now spent on swiping and clicking like takes the place of face-to-face meetings. As low-quality social media relationships increase, the true satisfaction which in-person meetings might provide diminishes. This cycle of frustration can only be broken by a radical decision. That decision is not to abandon social media, but to use it in a much smarter way, to support face-to-face interactions rather than pursue substitutes for them. We begin by accepting the fact that the only way to foster truly nurturing relationship is by meeting people in the physical world. We need to hear the tone of our partner's voice, detect the size of his or her pupils, and register the crease in the forehead, along with hundreds of other bodily cues that are the irreplaceable elements of personal presence. Textual communications such as social media posts, emails, and text messages are empty of presence and can never provide the social validation we crave. The illusion that they are capable of supporting meaningful relationships must be overcome. Newport does not suggest that we should delete all our social media accounts, only change the way that they are used. The goal is to use text messaging services to simplify information gathering or coordinate social events or to ask quick questions, but you'll no longer participate in open-ended, ongoing text-based conversations throughout your day. In other words, use a text message to contact a friend so that you can take a walk together or arrange to have lunch at a favorite spot. This is the smart use of technology, making it serve the needs of people rather than fostering the delusions of machine-mediated relationships. In the end, we have a choice, just like the young man I'm counseling. This future is not inevitable. We can make the technology serve and even enhance our humanity. The choice is ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Boyd. And I'm very sorry to all of the people out there that this got into technical difficulties, and it's a great embarrassment for me personally. But I hope we got it sufficiently there that, this was not, a total disaster. So now I'd like to bring on our next speaker, and this is Doug Smith. And Doug has, he's an independent consultant. He has over 40 years of experience, 70 publications, and you'll love this, in the fields of genetics, DNA sequencing, technology development, and bioinformatics. Doug's research experience includes numerous federally funded technology development and genome sequencing projects. He led one of the large-scale sequencing centers that helped decode the human genome and was involved in many other pioneering genome projects, as well as the development of commercial applications. Doug is also keenly interested in understanding the spiritual beings and events that lie behind the phenomena of the physical world. And as such, he has been a student of anthroposophy and Christology for nearly as long as his professional career. Well, no, I won't go into this, but it's been a great pleasure knowing Doug, and he's been part of this planning committee. So I hope you will welcome Doug Smith. And Doug, just come off of mute.
I can't do it.
You're off of mute. You're fine.
Okay, thanks. So I will share my screen, and if you can just let me know that everything is being displayed correctly before I sort of take off here.
The screen share is up, but not in slide share mode, right?
Yeah. Okay, is that working?
No, we're seeing your presenter mode.
Ah,
Switch displays. Yeah, there you go. Swap. There we go. Oh, and yeah,
All
okay.
right. We good? All right. So I'll begin by highlighting some anthroposophical teachings on heredity, reincarnation, and karma. And then I'll summarize some of the major developments in the study of genomics and genetic disease. And I'll highlight some advances in genetic technology and promising results of clinical trials for gene therapy to treat some severe genetic disorders. We will look briefly at the current trends in vitro fertilization technology and world population, and then we'll delve into the phenomenon of transhumanism and see what it seeks to bring in terms of transforming humanity using genetic technologies. Finally, we'll consider some of the key ethical issues and that this raises and indications for the future of humanity in the light of spiritual science. Okay. Okay, I need to do this a different way. Sorry. So in the next few slides, I'll summarize some teachings from Rudolf Steiner that relate to heredity. Oh, sorry. Okay. There we go. All right. Sorry. So in the next few slides, I'll summarize some teachings of Rudolf Steiner that relate to heredity, reincarnation, and karma. The impulses of heredity come through the father. Our natural science, which is focused on the kingdom of nature, is actually just a one-sided science of the father, the natural kingdom of the father. Heredity and death do not originate in the sense world. The materialist view perpetuates the idea that human existence is purely a sense world phenomenon, but our true origin and destiny are, of course, in the spirit. We shape that destiny as individuals to a greater or lesser degree, depending on our spiritual development. We choose the nationality, culture, parents, and body that we're born into. Heredity is connected with the mysteries of karma and birth, and death really represents a birth into the spiritual world. When speaking of a child, we must distinguish between the body of heredity, which is the model, and the individual body that is its successor. The individual body, the personal body of the human being, develops by degrees. Between the 7th and 14 years is the strongest activity of which the individual is capable that goes forward. Either the individuality conquers the forces of heredity during this period and begins to work his way out of them, or the individuality remains subject to the forces of heredity. And in the second case, the hereditary likeness to the parents simply continues beyond the 7th year, but it all depends upon the strength of the individuality and not the forces of heredity. Science of the Son of Christ is connected with the way human beings take hold of themselves to be psychically reborn and transported out of the kingdom of nature and into the kingdom of the spirit. The impulses of the Son must be taken up and elaborated by the soul in order to free itself from the body and hereditary forces. They enable the human beings to control themselves during life, which is given by the Father. Those who become children of the Father, brothers and sisters of Christ, gain control over that part of themselves which is free from the body. They manifest a new realm within them, the realm of the spirit, which is different, a different order than nature. Hereditary forces, which derive from the father forces that have been secreted into nature, influence the way we live our lives and are intimately connected with human destiny. The results of the previous earth life continuously plays into us when we act, so that as we act, we bring the spirit into the physical corporeality which we have acquired in our present existence. Anthroposophy can help us understand the impact of repeated earth lives and manage the impulses connected with the heredity and the father forces as we stand in the outer world with our actions in life. So this slide shows a few relationships as described in various ways and context by Rudolf Steiner. We can imagine that the realm, that between the realms, the relationship between the realms of the Father and the Spirit is analogous to a series of expanding circles from each one which meet at infinity. Christ, who's present in the life of nature, is the mediator between the realms of the Father and the Spirit.
Doug?
Reality,
Doug,
yeah.
we're having troubles with your slides are in large format, and so we're not seeing the whole slide.
Oh, well, do you want,
If you could make an adjustment to that so we can, and maybe, are you using wide slide mode?
I am. I don't know how it will show up if I do it somehow. Let me see what I can change here.
Just make it, I don't know, make it smaller, because we're
I
seeing
don't
your
know how to do
text.
that.
And also speak up a little bit more.
Yeah,
Sure.
you're too quiet.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure I can adjust that. And hang on one second. See if I can do something here. Now. Okay, so I'm just going to carry on.
All right. Just know that we don't see, I'll tell you what we're seeing right now is in the middle is karma, life and nature, heredity. And on the right is CHRIS. We don't see anything beyond. So you might have to explain what's there.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that really doesn't work.
Or slide, if you want us to see the picture, maybe slide the image. I don't know if you can.
Interesting.
If not, just carry on. Well,
I'm not sure how to make it do that. That's
okay.
kind of bizarre here. Let me see if I can. Yeah.
And the problem is, I think, is the window. Oh, there you go. Oh, almost had it.
Let me.
If while you're on this slide, you could go to design. If you click design, and then over on the right, customize, and pick slide size and standard, top one.
Standard.
Yep. And then ensure fit is fine.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Now
If
go
the-
back in slide mode, and I think you'll be okay.
Is that any better?
Well, you have to change the display settings, so swap. Swap. You had it, Doug. Just, no. Swap. Yeah. I think you should be okay now. You're on mute though, Doug.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't unmute myself because of the setting. So let's try again. Is that displaying better for you?
I had to come off of mute. It looks like it's going to be good. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so let's delve deeper into this natural science of the father and take some look at some major developments and discoveries in human genetics and genomics. These will provide a basis to understand what transhumanism might be capable of, and I promise we'll return to some anthroposophy later on. So I can see this. Is that slide showing up as kind of a white background?
Yes, it is, but we're still seeing the wide screen. You didn't, I don't know what happened.
Yeah, okay. So basically that didn't fix anything. In fact, it made it worse because now I can't see what's on the slides. All right. Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know if there's any way I can change the way it appears. Oops. I didn't want to do that. Yeah. All right. So I'm afraid we'll just have to go through this way because it's probably as good as it's going to get. So in May 2000, the initial sequencing of the human genome was announced at a major event at the White House. I was leading one of the labs that contributed to the project at the time and was actually there in the room when the announcement was made. Sequencing the human genome was a landmark achievement for science. It was the culmination of a decade of work by a large number of individuals throughout the world. In the 20 years that have elapsed since that time, advances in DNA sequencing technology have continued at an accelerated pace, reducing the cost per genome from about $100 million to less than 1,000. One sequencing technology company announced this year that it plans to reduce the cost to $100 per genome. This reduction in costs and actually increase in throughput has inspired several large new large-scale sequencing projects that collectively plan to sequence and analyze the genomes of over 3 million people over the next 3 to 5 years. The information that will be gained by studying the genomes of such a large number of individuals will enable us to learn a great deal about human evolution, inherited traits, and disease. Our body is made up of about 37 trillion cells of about 200 major cell types. Each one of those cells contains 2 copies of the genome, or about 6 billion base pairs of DNA. The 2 copies in our cells are derived from our parents through genetic inheritance. DNA is an information molecule, and the information it contains in the sequence of nucleotides is used to build up the physical structure of all the cells in our body. The genome contains about 20,000, encodes about 20,000 proteins and a similar number of major regulatory RNAs. It encodes many different isoforms of each gene, which are expressed in different cell types. Over 266,000 such isoforms have been characterized, which is a lot of information. So what have we learned about genetic variation, changes in individual nucleotides in the genome? In terms of diversity, humans differ on average by about 1 change in every 1,000 base pairs, or about 0.1%. About 90% of known genetic variants can be found in all populations throughout the world, in all countries. Only about 10% of variants are population specific. Most of the sequence variants in the genome have little or no apparent effect, but there are many common disorders and complex traits that are affected by changes in these common variants. For example, high blood pressure, psychiatric disorders, height, and intelligence, just to name a few. While each variant may have only a small effect, the combined effect of tens to hundreds of different variants can be significant. In contrast, approximately 80% of rare diseases are caused by single variants in specific genes that have very large effects. There are nearly 7,000 rare diseases that affect more than 25 million Americans, about half children. Variants associated with rare diseases are associated with the rare diseases and a large number of specific genes have been identified for those. Geneticists can trace the prehistoric movements of populations across the world through analysis of genetic variants in ancestral populations and in DNA recovered from ancient bones up to 45,000 years old in some cases. From this, we can identify genetic variants in modern humans that were selected in various populations or inherited through interbreeding of humans and closely related species like Neanderthals. Variant analysis can also be used to trace ancestry across modern populations, as many know because of the popular services like Ancestry.com. Modern humans derive from ancient African populations that migrated out of Africa over 55,000 years ago. And it's interesting to actually compare some of the things that Rudolf Steiner said about the colonies that came out of Atlantis and some of these migration pathways. Genetic disorders have a significant impact on human health. For example, it has been estimated that 20 to 30% of infant deaths are due to genetic disorders, and 30 to 50% of post-neonatal deaths are due to congenital malformations. Similarly, a significant percentage of pediatric hospitalizations involve genetic disorders, and about 50% of individuals with intellectual disability have a genetic basis for their disease. About 12% of adult hospitalizations are for genetic causes, and many chronic diseases and cancers have a significant genetic component. Rare single gene disorders occur with a prevalence of about 1 in 100 births. They are more than twice as common in the Eastern Mediterranean region due to social acceptance of consanguineous marriages. In many Arab countries, for example, the first cousin marriages may reach 25 to 30% of all marriages, which is surprising. You can see the difference it makes. There are numerous examples of genes where mutations have both positive and negative effects. For example, hemoglobin variants that cause sickle cell disease and several other severe diseases also confer resistance to malaria. Variants in 3 genes associated with darker skin pigmentation, which protects against UV radiation and skin cancer, are selected against selected against in northern populations because there is less sun exposure, but UV radiation is also required for vitamin D biosynthesis, which is an essential nutrient. Variants in the CCR5 gene are associated with resistance to HIV and smallpox, but those same variants weaken memory T cell immune responses and lower resistance to influenza and West Nile virus. There are hundreds of loci in the human genome that show a significant signal of recent positive selection in specific populations. This is the genomic signature of evolution in action. Human head size is another trait where genes have been found to have both positive and negative effects. Head size is determined by rapid growth in the first years of life. There are numerous complex developmental processes involved, which are regulated by many genes and growth pathways. A recent large genetic study found that 67 genetic loci influence head size independent of height. These loci are enriched for genes that are involved in macrocephaly syndromes up to 37-fold and cancer up to 9-fold. Thus, many of the genes that regulate early brain and cranial growth are associated with propensity to cancer later in life. Finally, let's take a quick look at intelligence and longevity, two specific traits that transhumanists are interested in. Intelligence has substantial heritability, about 54%. A 2008 genetic study found 47 intelligence-associated genes, many of which are involved in cell regulation and neuronal function. Studies in centenarians, those are people older than 100 years, or super centenarians, people older than 110, have resulted in some interesting findings and trends, but not very many associated genes so far. For example, these people have lower than expected incidence of chronic illness, inflammation, and oxidative stress, and specific variants in two genes, ApoE and FOXO3, are enriched, and those variants are different from the ones that are associated with Alzheimer's and vascular disease from ApoE. So let's move over to gene therapy, get a picture of that. Most rare genetic diseases have no approved therapies, and there are many of those are life-threatening or serious conditions. Gene therapy-related research and development in the area of rare disease has been an active area of research over the past 20 years and is now beginning to show some promising results. Research in this area is growing at a rapid rate. Developing safe and effective therapeutics to treat rare diseases is very challenging and expensive. Gene therapy patients require long-term follow-up to monitor effectiveness and the possibility of delayed adverse events. There are currently 277 clinical trials for gene therapies that are either active or recruiting patients, and a similar number of additional trials that have already been completed. There are just a couple of promising, here are a couple of promising candidates that are showing positive results. There is Zolgensma for the treatment of spinal muscular atrophy in young children. In this therapy, a non-replicating virus vector is used to deliver a functional survival motor neuron gene into the patient's cells, and this is effective in relieving the symptoms of the disease. Zolgensma is another one that was approved by the FDA this year, the cost of the therapy is around $2 million. It's one of the most expensive therapies ever developed. But the drug company justifies it in terms of the costs of treating patients being $750,000 per treatment. And this only has to be done once. Another treatment, Zynteglo, is showing promising results for transfusion-dependent beta thalassemia and severe sickle cell disease. And in this case, an anti-sickling variant of the hemoglobin gene is introduced into stem cells of the patient, and the cells are transplanted back into the patient's bone marrow for the treatment. So another approach is CRISPR gene editing, which you see in the news a lot. CRISPR is a defense protein that protects bacterial cells from viruses by destroying the viral DNA after infection. It has been repurposed and modified by geneticists to enable gene editing. Different modes have been developed that have various advantages and disadvantages, and all of them are capable of targeting a single site in the human genome to introduce specific mutations but all of them can also cause off-target mutations at other sites in the genome. So CRISPR editing is a very powerful tool, but it requires caution in its use. There are 12 ongoing, either recruiting or active clinical trials using gene editing for gene therapy. Two of those have been, and two others have been completed. There are two general approaches. One is an approach, in vivo approach, where a CRISPR reagent that targets a particular tissue or cell type is administered directly to a patient, and an ex vivo approach, where cells from the patient are edited in the lab and then introduced back into the patient. In 2018, two babies with a CCR5 gene deletion were born after in vitro fertilization and CRISPR gene editing of the embryos. It set a firestorm of controversy in the scientific community and the general public. And the scientist who led the project was fired from his position and eventually jailed. But the Pandora's box of human gene editing was opened. Since then, the American Society of Human Genetics, the world's largest community of human genetics professionals with about 8,000 members, put out a position statement on germline gene editing, which you may find surprising in some respects. The statement says, at this time, given the nature of unanswered scientific, ethical, and policy questions, it's inappropriate to perform germline editing that culminates in human pregnancy. Currently, there's no reason to prohibit in vitro germline genome editing on human embryos and gametes with appropriate oversight and consent from donors to facilitate research on the possible future clinical applications of gene editing. There should be no prohibition on making public funds available to support this research. Future clinical application of human germline genome editing should not proceed unless at a minimum there's a compelling medical rationale or an evidence base that supports its clinical use, an ethical justification, and a transparent public process to solicit and incorporate stakeholder input. So what about in vitro fertilization technology? In 2018, there were about 306,000 cycles performed at about 456 reporting clinics across the United States that resulted in about 74,000 live births and over 81,000 live-born infants. About a third of those were egg or embryo banking cycles where the eggs or embryos were frozen for future use. The use of IVF has almost doubled over the last decade, and approximately almost 2% of all infants born in the United States every year are conceived using IVF. The rate has been going up and down in different countries, but it's a popular procedure. The success rate of IVF drops off significantly with age, and it's not recommended for older women. Additional factors that affect the success rate are add-ons such as embryo selection by pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, ovarian stimulation, freezing, and embryo banking. Finally, I'd like to mention another genetic technology that could have a significant impact in our world. It's called gene drive technology, and it can change entire populations. CRISPR and gene silencing technologies can be used to drive selected traits through whole populations in just a few generations, including killer genes designed to drive species to extinction, like the mosquitoes that carry malaria, for example. Beneficial applications are anticipated by scientists in areas of human health, agriculture, nature conservation, to mitigate or eliminate various pests, diseases, and invasive plant species. The majority of gene drive applications involve genetic engineering of novel traits. Research dollars are flowing and trials are taking place, but without release of gene drive organisms into the environment so far. Some scientists and bioethicists have considered the concept of gene drives in humans. Gene drives in humans would take a long time, up to centuries, because of our long generation time. Gene drive proponents argue that they would be low risk because the genes would be so slow to spread in a population that there would be there would be time to create and release an immunizing reversal drive if they needed to. But there is significant potential for negative outcomes, including long-term unintended consequences and off-target effects. Bioethicists have now started to grapple with the ethical issues around this. I'm going to try one thing here in terms of the, oops. Okay, never mind. Hang on. So, all right, so now that you've endured my crash course in human genetics and technology, let's consider transhumanism. What is it? What do transhumanists want to do with genetics, and why is it catching on? The concept of transhumanism was coined by a British evolutionary biologist, Sir Julian Huxley, in 1957. He said the human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself. Man will remain man, but transcending himself by realizing new possibilities of and for his human nature. I believe in transhumanism. Once there are enough people who can truly say that the human species will be on the threshold, who can say that, the human species will be on the threshold of a new kind of existence, as different from ours as ours is from peaking man. It will be the last and consciously, it will at last be consciously fulfilling its real destiny. Transhumanism focuses on technologies that can enhance normal human functions to create advanced or artificially enhanced humans. Post-humanism goes further to include machine humans, biotechnological non-humans, and conscious in silico entities with general artificial intelligence. For this talk, I will focus just on transhumanism and its ability to modify humans using genetic technologies, or its aims. For millennia, the desire to overcome normal human capacities and achieve a more perfect ideal has captured the human imagination. Witness epic tales of humans with godlike powers, eternal life, and the 20th century phenomenon of comic book superheroes. The goal of improving the human condition and overall health has been the primary driver for biomedical innovation. The emergence of new technologies has provided a means to transition from external modifications like prostheses to genetic ones that can be made permanent and transmissible. The eugenics movement of the 19th and 20th centuries sought to improve the human race, but resorted to crude methods like sterilization and genocide, known as negative eugenics. Sir Francis Galton sought to improve populations through selective breeding and negative eugenics. Alfred Ploetz founded the German Society of Racial Hygiene, and his ideas on the superiority of the Aryan race strongly influenced Nazi leaders. We know where that led. Charles Davenport founded the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor, New York. He broadly promoted eugenics views in the US and worldwide, and it gained many followers. In 2001, Julian Savulescu published his Principle of Procreative Beneficence. It says, in relation to in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, that couples or single reproducers should select the child of the possible children they could have who is expected to have the best life, or at least as good a life as the others, based on the relevant available information. He argues that selection for non-disease genes which significantly impact on well-being is morally required. Such traits would include things like intelligence, memory, self-discipline, or impulse control. He also says that procreative beneficence is not the same as eugenics because it is a parental decision aimed at producing the best child and not a public policy promoting sterilization of less worthy individuals. Most prominent transhumanists readily adopt Savulescu's concept of procreative beneficence. They believe that rational evolution governed by conscious design should replace natural selection, which is random and painfully slow. They believe strongly that it's a matter of personal choice to pursue transhumanist genetic modifications. Many ethicists do not agree with Savulescu, however. An example is Ronald Green, professor emeritus of religion and ethics at Dartmouth College. He fully supports the use of the reproductive use of gene editing technology for the prevention and elimination of serious genetic diseases, and believes that in the case of severe diseases, we also have a moral obligation to do so. He does not see this extending to optional genetic interventions, however, like the enhancements that would affect appearance, strength, athleticism, or intelligence. Nick Bostrom, a professor at Oxford University and influential author, is a strong proponent of transhumanism. He describes it as an interdisciplinary approach to understanding and evaluating the opportunities for enhancing the human condition and the human organism opened up by the advancement of technology. The enhancement options he envisions include radical extension of human health span, eradication of disease, elimination of unnecessary suffering, and augmentation of human intellectual, physical, and emotional capacities. He asserts that human nature is a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remold in desirable ways. Current humanity need not be the end point of evolution. Bostrom also writes about posthumanism and the possibility of creating super intelligent machines, along with other potential developments that could radically alter the human condition. Here are a couple of quotes from some other visionary and popular transhumanists. David Wood of London Futurists says, "Transhumanism will grant us awesome powers to proactively remake humanity. We can transcend our original biological nature and become as if divine. We'll be as far ahead of current human capacities as current humans exceed the prowess of their ape forebears." David Pierce of Humanity Plus says, "If we want eternal life, then we'll need to rewrite our bug-ridden genetic code and become godlike. Only high-tech solutions can ever eradicate suffering from the world. Compassion alone is not enough." There are now several major countries with transhumanist political parties, including the UK, the US, Australia, Germany, Canada, and Russia. Zoltan Istvan of the US Transhumanist Party was a candidate for governor of California in 2018 and for the Republican presidential nomination this year. He says, "The bold code of transhumanism will rise. That's an inevitable and undeniable fact. We are the future, like it or not, and it needs to be molded, guided, and handled correctly by the strength and wisdom of transhuman scientists." The Transhumanist Bill of Rights, which you can find on the US Transhumanist Party webpage, includes an interesting declaration of rights that apply to all sentient entities, including genetically modified humans and a variety of imagined future entities like cyborgs, digital intelligences, intellectually enhanced animals and plants, and other advanced sapient life forms. Not clear what he's referring to on the last one, angels or aliens perhaps, but you can be the judge. So have you noticed that all the people I've mentioned so far in connection with eugenics and transhumanism are men? Here's a perspective from a member of the other half of humanity. Transhumanist literature is written by white men and seems directed toward their specific concerns, with little regard to its potential ableist, sexist, and racist impacts. In the social milieu of prenatal testing, one receives the impression that reproduction would be perfected if women were not involved at all. The womb is a risky place for the fetus to gestate. The fetus is transformed into a site of risk, and autonomous reproducers should embrace their role as risk managers in order to stave off undesirable outcomes. And here's a more spiritual perspective from Agneta Sutton, who's a senior lecturer in moral theology at the University of Chichester. Advocates of parental autonomy, resulting in the child being reduced to a product of human design, are not seeing and treating the child as an equal. Rejecting the old eugenics, the transhumanist movement is nonetheless endorsing what is called soft eugenics, but which is anything but soft. It seeks the elimination of undesired traits in the unborn, and therewith the elimination of those who bear them. The person who is yet to be, the child to be, is a matter of choice of the individuals who are already in existence. Like Prometheus, who reached for and stole the flame of fire from Zeus, they reach not only for superhuman powers, but they reach for godlike powers over life and death. The materialist view of transhumanism seems to carry all the way through to the making of moral decisions. Savulescu and Person state, human beings are not by nature equipped with a moral psychology that empowers them to cope with the moral problems of modern society. In another paper, they posit the existence by 2045 of a God machine that would monitor the thoughts, beliefs, desires, and intentions of every human being. It would be an activist God intervening with its almighty power when a threshold of some sentient being's interests was crossed. In a paper on ethical issues in advanced artificial intelligence, Nick Bostrom said, to the extent that ethics is a cognitive pursuit, a superintelligence could also easily surpass humans in the quality of its moral thinking. This is what we are up against. So where are we headed? Let's return to spiritual science, starting with some things Rudolf Steiner said about cosmic forces in human procreation and development. Sun and moon forces play a strong role in procreation and development from the cellular level up to the macro level of the whole body. Sun forces stream inward from the periphery on the sun's rays. They enable the human being to become a bearer of the ego, the individuality or I. They mold the human form into an image of the ego. They give form to the embryo developing in the mother's womb from outside. They give birth to us as an individuality. Moon forces, on the other hand, radiate outward from the metabolic center within the organism. They shape the human being from inside out, working by attraction to mold the human countenance. They lead substance over into the realm of the living. They stimulate the inner reproductive processes of the organism to give rise to procreation, reproduction, and propagation, the forming of the so-called human race. So they work in polar antithesis to each other, but their interaction gives rise to the whole being of humanity. The sun places us as an individual on the earth, while the moon charms the whole human race down to earth. These cosmic forces of sun and moon also act on the developing embryo at the level of individual cells. The sun forces stream inward from the periphery, bringing formative forces which are expressed physically in terms of the cellular context within the organism. These forces act on the cell nucleus to regulate gene expression, which in turn determines the cell's individuality or cell type. Moon forces act from the center outwards. In the cell, this leads to messenger RNA expression, which in turn directs the production of specific proteins to build up the substance of the cell. Of course, there's a lot of biochemistry involved, but these are some of the basic ways the forces manifest. In contrast to the moon forces, which give rise to the physical forces of heredity, reproduction, and building up of the organism, the highest cosmic moral forces come from Saturn. Saturn is the source of cosmic equity, the great restorer of the balance for all that happens upon Earth. Saturn forces enter into our lives through all that lives in karma, from incarnation to incarnation, which you can also think of as holding a kind of cosmic memory of our entire planetary system. Saturn forces also mediate the connection between the astral body and the ego. They regulate the integration of the astral body in the whole upper part of the human organization. Spiritual entities are involved when human beings are born and enter this physical world, and then again when they leave it for the non-physical world. These elemental spirits of birth and death are also serving technology, industry, and human commerce. Scientists are influenced and guided by these spirits in laboratories and workshops wherever the spirit of invention is active. These spirits are providing the inspiration. However, these elemental spirits are the enemies of everything human beings seek and desire for their welfare and well-being here in the physical world. They are messengers of Ahriman, and we need to understand where they are leading us. By the way, here's a question. Why do you suppose we always depict a eureka moment by a light bulb going off in our head? We're now living in the fifth post-Atlantean cultural age, the age of the consciousness soul, which began in 1413 and will last for another 1500 years or so. In a nutshell, the task of this age is to develop an awareness of the truth that can permeate our shadowy intellect and enable a living perception of the spiritual within the universe. It represents an evolving impulse to consciously open up ourselves to the life of the spirit. As the age of the consciousness soul progresses, the human soul will withdraw more and more from the body. More and more, we will encounter people whose bodies are empty to such an extent that a powerful Ahrimanic spirit can live in them. Their individualities will be suppressed. Such people will consider it pathological for anyone to even think in terms of soul and spirit. Rudolf Steiner even said that they would develop a medicine to treat this. I think our modern antipsychotic drugs fall into this category. The struggle with evil is intimately connected with the development of the consciousness soul. Our commercial, industrial, and technological civilization harbors elements that will lead to the decline and fall of this post-Atlantean epoch, just as the misuse of elemental creative powers in the Atlantean epoch led to the destruction of that civilization. We are engaged in something that will lead to catastrophe. The only way to counteract this is for human beings to take up the impulses that come from spiritual knowledge. 2,000 years ago, the Christ impulse was born out of the forces of death for the salvation of humanity. Through the experience of evil in the present age, Christ is again able to appear again in the etheric body. And I think that actually echoes something that Boyd told us. I would like to call to mind Rudolf Steiner's teachings on Sorat, the Antichrist sun demon, which corresponds to the beast described by St. John in the book of Revelation. This intensely evil being has made 3 attacks during the last 1400 years, one in 666, one in 1332, and one in our own time at the turn of the millennium. Each of these attacks was focused on preventing human beings from attaining a true understanding of the Christ impulse. I will focus on the last one at the turn of the millennium, the echoes of which are still playing out today. Rudolf Steiner indicated that Sorat's primary goal would be to prevent us from having any experience of Christ in the etheric by promoting sensuous passions, a kind of soulless, self-centered materialism, and by trying to deceive us into believing that the core consciousness of our I is a product of the physical sense world. These ideas are very prevalent today. I think we can also see these impulses expressed in the thoughts of transhumanists. The rise of transhumanism could well be a Sorat impulse. Rudolf Steiner described the ideas of eugenics as the rumblings of brains emptied of soul, an echo of ancient Atlantean science, which had to be withdrawn from humanity because of misuse through the blackest of black magic. I think this also applies, perhaps to a greater extent, to the ideas of transhumanism. So May of the year 2000 was the date that the sequencing of the human genome was announced. There was also a major alignment of the sun, moon, and major planets in the constellation of Aries at that time. In addition, there was the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn later the same month. Of course, there are many other things that happened around that time, but this is one that people may not have considered, an important event in the evolution of humanity with high potential for both good and evil. Astrosopher Willie Sucher described great conjunctions as a meeting between Saturn, the cosmic memory of all that has happened in the past, and Jupiter, the divine creative thoughts of what is to come. In the present age, those divine creative thoughts include the revelation of Christ in the etheric and the ideas of spiritual science. Great conjunctions happen every 20 years, and we will have another one at the time of the winter solstice this year. We can anticipate a strong deepening of inward spiritual forces when this occurs. So here are some questions to consider concerning the subjects of genetics and transhumanism we have been considering. Efforts to eliminate inherited genetic disease will undoubtedly continue and accelerate. How will this affect incarnating souls who seek to resolve their karma? How will it affect the evolution of humanity? Selection of desirable transhumanist traits is likely to occur at some point, probably not very far off. Will it hinder the overcoming of hereditary forces and expression of the individuality in childhood and beyond? Will it affect the development of spiritual thinking and perception? How will it affect incarnating souls? Finally, as discoveries in genetics continue, will genetic determinism take over? Will people come to believe that all human characteristics and susceptibility to disease are simply a result of their genetics, leaving no role for the individuality and the spirit? Rudolf Steiner warned that the application of genetic selection to human beings would lead to great monstrosities. He said that when esoteric truths that will be revealed during the fifth post-Atlantean era are added to genetic selection, an unbelievable power over human beings will be gained through always selecting the fit. It is not only that the fit will be selected, but the striving for a certain esoteric invention to make the fit always more fit would lead to a tremendous exploitation of power that would oppose precisely the good tendencies of the fifth post-Atlantean period. Does this remind you at all of gene drives, transhumanism, and superintelligence? Bostrom predicts the brains doing the AI research will become AIs themselves. Will those same brains also be directing the genetic experiments? In the seventh post-Atlantean cultural age, the time will come when human beings no longer incarnate in bodies derived from physical parents. In that age, women will be infertile and children will no longer be born in the manner of today, if evolution takes its normal course. Human beings will instead begin a different relationship with the earth as beings of soul and spirit, living and moving in the clouds, rain, lightning, and thunder. They will pulsate, as it were, through the manifestations of nature for an additional 2,500 years. In a still later epoch, their relationship to the earth will become even more spiritual. But it is also possible that something else happens. Alternatively, our harmonic powers, which are becoming extremely strong today, might succeed in preventing the rightful course of Earth evolution. It would then become possible for human beings, by no means for their good, to be held in the same form of physical life beyond this time in the 6th or 7th millennium. Human beings will become much more like animals while continuing to be held in the grip of physical incarnation. One of the endeavors of the harmonic powers is to keep humanity fettered too long on the earth in order to divert it from its normal evolution. Is this where transhumanism is leading us? So I submit to you that we need to be seeking a different kind of transhumanism, one based on the development of spiritual qualities, which my guess is a lot of you would agree. And I'll leave you with this meditation from Rudolf Steiner, which I think indicates the path we must follow. I gaze into the darkness. In it, there arises light, living light. Who is this light in the darkness? It is I myself in my reality. This reality of the I does not enter into my earthly life. I am but a picture of it. But I shall find it again when, with goodwill for the spirit, I shall have passed through the gate of death. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Doug, and thank you very much, Boyd. We will now move on to our Q&A for the next half hour, or if people can stay up that late. And so I'm looking for the questions, and I have a couple here that I will ask. Let me get, the first question, let's see. Maybe, Doug, you're familiar with the story of Cain and Abel and how the sons of God, as to say, the offspring of Abel, found the daughters of Cain, or of men, to be fair and took them wives, from them wives. And these became the giants, the Nephilim. And do you see a correlation? Was that a kind of transhumanism of that era that's being repeated now?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm not so familiar with that stream of of thought, the Cain and Abel thing, but there are interesting connections with certainly with early mythology, and I mean, this being the core of some of the the thought that comes out of the Bible from very early times. So,
Yeah. I don't know, Boyd, do you have any thoughts on that? You're on mute, Boyd. Boyd, come off of mute.
Oh, there it is. Okay, I got it. Thanks. You had me automatic muted. Actually, I don't have too many thoughts about that at the moment. I thought that the mythological persons that are being represented by transhumanism, would correlate with somebody like Prometheus. I would think of a Promethean link there. But I have to admit, I don't have too many thoughts about that. You're on mute, Andrew. I can't hear you.
I don't know how that happened. Okay, so this question is for you, Boyd. It asks, did companies like Google know in advance that their software would become addictive, or Facebook? Or did they fall into finding that out and then built it up?
Well, that's a very,
before they built the software.
Sure. No, that's a very interesting question. Making software addictive was actually discovered by Google. That was in the early 2000s, around 2004. And what was happening with Google at the time was that they actually thought they were going to go out of business. So they had to find a model to get, to get revenue in as quickly as they could. And so what they did is they turned to advertising. And they came up with a model so that the more likely it was that a user would click on a link, this is where the AdWords come from. The more likely it was that users click on a link, the higher the price they could charge for that particular click. And so advertisers that clicked on those links, paid Google much more money, and advertisers that didn't get clicked gave Google less money. So what happened is Google took their behavioral surplus. Now, behavioral surplus is the data for a user. You know, you may not know this, but we have 100,000 user profile values whenever we go online with Facebook. And so what Google discovered is that they could make much more money by predicting what the user would do. And so they very precisely aligned with what the user would do with their payment plan. Now, actually, Facebook took it one step further because with Google, they didn't try to condition people's behavior. What they did was they just looked at their behavior and they saw that certain types of users tended to click on certain types of links. So then they could price the cost per link accordingly. But what Facebook did, and you know, it's on one of the slides there, is that they saw that they needed to actually control user behavior rather than simply respond to what the user behavior was based on their profile attributes. And so they actually started going in and creating algorithms. And these algorithms are training algorithms. In other words, what they're trying to do is get the user to conform more and more closely with the profile attributes that have been captured through, you know, behavioral surplus. So Facebook took it to the next stage. And what they decided to do was to try and get users to perform. And they created algorithms to train users. And those training algorithms have turned out to be very effective. So that's pretty much the history of how that came about.
Thank you. Wow. Doug, I think this one is for you. Suppose you're a mother and a father. You're dealing with a mother and father to be, sorry. And the mother is concerned about something in her genetic history, and she doesn't want her kids to have that. So are there companies today that will sort of go through the ovaries and find eggs that are not going to have that genetic problem?
Well, that's, yeah, one of the things they do is, you know, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Basically, the way it's done typically is you make fertilized embryos and then you test them and identify the ones you want, essentially, through their genetic properties. Yeah.
I see. So they get a large sample of fertilized eggs, and then the relative value.
It's not going to be a large number, but they basically will test any embryos that they're able to generate during vitro fertilization, and they can do that using the polar bodies, the parts that don't actually get, you know, incorporated into the embryo. So that is a safe way to do that testing.
Okay. We hear about COVID vaccines being developed that people say will create genetic alterations in the human population. Is that what you were talking about as gene driving? Any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really something completely different. Gene drives are changes that you make in the genome of an organism that basically gets propagated and then has the effect of inducing that change in its progeny, essentially. So it's a totally different mechanism. Yeah, and as far as COVID vaccines anything to do with genetic changes, they wouldn't. That's not something that vaccines do.
Thank you. Boyd, this one might be for you. Doug mentioned the elemental spirits of birth and death. Could you speak about elemental beings in machines, or is that not part of your?
Oh, no, I'm glad to do that because there was actually you know, as you and I know, Frank, I mean, we talked a lot about harmonic beings in relationship to the internet. And it seems like, you know, there is a very strong connection there. And the connection has to do specifically with the way that our system works. You know, our nervous system, excuse me here, our nervous system is based on electromagnetism. And as we talked about, you know, during the MysTech beginners course, the harmonic double actually works inside the nervous system, is part of the electromagnetic system that we have. And when a person goes online, what some researchers have found, and I'm speaking specifically about Andreas Neider from Germany, what Andreas Neider has proposed, you know, and obviously I'm not going to say for certain about this because this, you know, requires clairvoyant understanding and things that I don't possess. But what he was saying is that, you know, just as when we're growing up, when a child is 7 years old, the etheric body becomes available for them to be able to think and reason, and, you know, no longer those forces that are in the etheric body are no longer directed towards growing the organism. They're released so that those forces can be used with memory, they can be used with thought, and they can, you know, they're the free forces of our attention. Now, what the internet does is it entrains those forces of our intention. You know, it takes over those forces of our attention when we're online. And what Andreas Neider proposes is that the harmonic double is actually working directly with the internet, that the internet is taking the place of the free forces that we develop in the etheric body as we grow older. So there's a direct connection between the etheric double and those forces. Now, again, this is something that I don't have enough, you know, direct spiritual insight to see into, but I do have enough technical information to tell you that people do diminish their memory power and they diminish their reasoning power through excessive internet usage, that both of those forces in us are getting, again, I like to use the word entrained, because what they're doing is basically taking over our attention and redirecting it toward things that the internet wants us to pay attention to. And we do have an elemental being inside of us when we're born, which is the harmonic double. And I think that that harmonic double plays a role in keeping our attention focused on the internet. And I go into a lot of detail on this as far as the way it affects memory too, because our memory is being impacted by the way that we use the internet. Because instead of concentrating on facts that we can build up into an array of information to find new insight, we're being distracted by going from one thing to another thing to another thing to another thing before we can put all that information together into a coherent intellectual structure. And that is actually causing a diminishment of our ability to have new insights, because we are no longer as capable as we were before of overcoming that distraction. And I think that our harmonic beings encourage this, let's say.
Well, do you have a recommendation for people who their jobs require them to spend 8 hours a day, and then their families require them to spend another 4 hours a day on Facebook or something? How do they not become overwhelmed or addicted, or, you know, one of the other negative aspects of this?
Well, I think the best approach is to use the Steiner exercises. And again, and I have some very specific exercises in mind. The first one, the one that helps us to concentrate, is the pencil exercise. You know, what you do is you take a simple object, for example, a pencil, put it in front of you and try to grasp it exactly. You imagine the pencil, what it is like, what it is made of, what it is used for, and you try to grasp its essence. So, you know, by concentrating your mind this way, what you're doing is you're beginning to understand where spirituality comes from. For instance, having brought this into consciousness, the nature of our attention is the core of our spiritual activity. We realize that the seemingly abstract, dead nature of our thinking is only an illusion. But it is this appearance that has been copied by the internet technologists in the form of computers and the internet. In other words, the internet is a reflection of our dead thinking. So if we can enliven that thinking by using the Steiner concentration exercise, we can discover, the existence of the spiritual in our minds. And once we discover that existence of the spiritual, we can overcome the dead thinking, which is actually what we get from the internet. The internet is constantly, blanking out the spirit and reducing our mind to the functions of the material brain. So by concentration exercises, we can get past that, and we can start to develop the living thinking. Another exercise that's very powerful for overcoming internet addiction is the cloud exercise, which you probably heard of, to go outside every day at the same time and look at the clouds. And what happens if you do this is it leads to the experience, if one carries it out patiently and long enough, that there is indeed a thinking before thinking, with which we are always superconsciously connected, but which escapes us because of the degeneration of this thinking into the abstract concepts of our everyday consciousness. So by doing the cloud exercise, once again, we can create living thinking. And through this living thinking, we overcome the dead thinking, which is what is being poured into us through the internet.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the cloud exercise. I often mention to people the need to go just outside for a walk every day at roughly the same time. So you experience the rhythm of nature as well through the course of the year by going out at the same time, but also all of the sunlight that you are absorbing in through the skin, but through your senses, your eyesight especially. All of this is important part of the counterbalance. And then for those of you in this conference, you'll get to experience eurythmy on Saturday and Sunday morning, also as a counterbalance to all of the immersion into the internet and all that our society seems to demand. Okay, so Doug, I have one more question for you, and that is the permanency of gene edits. Is there any evidence that a plant, for example, that's been modified with GMO returns back to, or attempts to return back? Maybe it's asymptotic, it never gets there, but does it return in some way to its former self?
So as long as the changes are germline changes, they're permanent, essentially. Now, it is possible to intentionally change it back, or it's possible for an organism. I mean, organisms evolve, but of course that takes many generations for them to evolve. And, so these change, anything in the genome is subject to change in the future through evolutionary forces. Unless there's some, so like they're just normal stable changes, just like anything else in the genome. Once they get established at the level of germline, which is why there's a lot of the focus now is on non-germline editing, and all these gene therapies are done with cells, somatic cells that are taken, let's say, from an organ, like the liver or something, and then edited. Those cells never affect the germline, so those are never passed on to the other generation. But yes, if you do make permanent germline changes in plants or any other kind of organism, they're just as stable as anything else in the organism. And it takes another kind of genetic change to alter that.
Wow. There's another question that just came in. And I think you guys have sort of answered this, but I'll put it out there. Where do diseases come from?
I'll let Doug do that one.
Okay. Well, I mean, of
think
course,
that's in a spiritual science perspective.
yeah, from the spiritual science perspective, these are problems with our spirit and its relationship to the body. You know, and if we had that connection, that true connection to the Christ forces, the higher, you know, spirit, we could actually physically change our body, you know, just out of our spiritual intention. And I think, you know, when you look back to what's written in the Bible and a lot of those healing stories, that's what's going on there. But, you know, most of us have not reached that point. Yeah, you know, and so, you know, these genetic issues in our body, and not just genetic, but, you know, some environmental, you know, illnesses and things, they affect us, and we're not able to overcome that, you know. So, I mean, that's where medicines, and they can be all different kinds of medicines, come in, of course.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. Frank, if you want to come off of mute, did you have any more that you saw from the chat box? Oh, okay, guess not.
Yeah. Let me see. I got a lot of windows open here.
I can imagine.
Yeah, there might be one, or, you know, it's also getting late here, even in the West. Maybe not in the Philippines.
No. Yeah, we're just getting up.
Yeah, your day's just starting. No, I think we're done, and we can wrap up, Andrew.
Okay. Well, tomorrow we start early, meaning 8:30 in the morning. We will be going into three folding to start the morning with Rosemary McMullen, and its related to that is the work of Hegel. And we will spend the morning, that part of the morning, looking at three folding and why it's important to MysTech even. So hope you all can join us tomorrow morning, and then we will continue on during the day, obviously, with a very full schedule tomorrow. So with that, I think we'll close for tonight. Okay. And I will then, thank you for joining us.